Okay, let's take a look at this question. First step, can you please tell me what does the question ask? Since before we answer the question, we should be very clear about what we should answer. Yes, in this question, it's about the explanation of either unipolar depression or anorexia nervosa, and also the evaluation to the explanation. In this case, our answer can be generally divided into two parts, right? Which is explanation and evaluation. So we can write here explanation and also evaluation. And then we should notice some details like the limit of the answer. And we can read the question again. In your studies of clinical psychology, you will have learned about either unipolar depression or anorexia nervosa. Evaluate one non-biological explanation. So the detail is non-biological explanation, right? Yes, exactly. So in this question, it says that the explanation should be non-biological, which means that we should only consider the psychological perspective to explain the mental disorder. So the detail is the non-biological explanation to the evaluation. This is the only detail in this question. And last step before we write the answer, what we can do before we write the answer. What do you think? Is there anything else we should consider about? Yes, agree. Yes. So last step, before we write the answer, we should take a look at the credits. So what the credit for this question? Okay, it's 16 credit. So it can be considered as a large question, we can say, because the credit is a lot. So we should be clear about the distribution of the credits, especially for the question with a large amount of credits, like how many credits for explanation and how many credits for evaluation. The distribution of the credits is such an important thing. This is very essential for us to write the answer. Now, can you have a guess about the credit distribution for this question? Now we have 16 credits. And we should answer two parts, explanation and also evaluation. So how can we distribute the 16 credits in total? Yes, your answer approaches the right answer. Actually, if we practice the past paper for a period of time, we can be very familiar about the credit structure for each type of question. For this kind of 16 credit question that the content is divided into two parts, we can easily divide their credits. These two parts simply corresponds to L1 and also L3. AL1 and AL3. Normally we put 6 credits on L1, which is the explanation part. So 6 credits. And the rest 10 credits we'll put on L3, which is the evaluation part. So before answering the question, generally we have 3 steps, especially for the question with high credits. Now, we should recall the relevant knowledge to answer the question, right? Okay, firstly for the explanation part. For unipolar depression, the explanation can generally divide it into two perspectives. The first one is biological, and the next one is non-biological. But we said that before, this question requires us to only focus on the non-biological explanation. Here, this is the detail of this question, so we should pay attention to this point. So now we should recall the non-biological perspective to explain the unipolar depression. And for this perspective, can you recall something about this knowledge? You can just provide some keywords for me, and then we can explain this kind of keywords together. Yes, the first keyword is the cognition, right? Because the non-biological perspective to explain the unipolar depression must be the cognitive perspective. This is the primary factor. So, cognition. As the explanation part. For full explanation part, so this is the first part. And we can firstly look into the cognition perspective. What do you think you can say for the cognition explanation? You can continue to say some key points. Anything you can remember? Yeah, attributional bias. Attributional bias is a very typical point in the cognition explanation. What does it mean? Do you still remember that? Yes, agree. Great. This means that people may have different attitudes and thinking process towards the causes of the event, right? For example, some people will think more about the internal cause, that they think they are responsible for what happens to themselves, where other people are more likely to think about the external factors, supporting the opinion that events are beyond their control. So there are two possibilities generally for different people towards the causes of events. So this is the first key point. And next, do you have some idea about other relevant points towards the cognitive perspective? Yes, Beck's theory, right? So we can see, we firstly talk about the depression and the cognitive model of depression, right? What is the cognitive model of depression? Why we can use the cognitive perspective to explain the depression? This is the first thing we need to explain, right? How we use the cognitive model to explain the depression. So firstly, we should say that we assume depression is caused by cognitive errors because we should focus on the cognitive perspective and we should clearly state how the cognitive perspective can lead to the depression. So in terms of the cognitive perspective, we should firstly assumes depression is caused by cognitive errors. And also, what is the cognitive errors? We need to further explain that, right? So what is the cognitive errors? That involves what? Yes, it involves the negative self-view and irrational thinking. So the first small part and explanation part is the cognitive model of depression. We just have a beginning, have a tiny start. So the cognitive model of depression. And next part, we should continue to explain the depressive thinking. Because we mentioned before, the cognitive errors involves negative self-view and irrational thinking. And we should further explain some key characteristics of the depressive thinking. like the faulty patterns of thought will lead to distorted information processing. And the whole process for each individual, how they form the distortion of information processing, we should use the negative schema to explain the whole process, right? So the depressive thinking, we should explain it fully. So how we explain that? Can you just organize this point and to say few sentences to express this point of view? You can have like 1 minute or 30 seconds to organize. Yes, exactly. The answer is really detailed. We just really need this kind of detailed wording in our answer, because only if when our answer is detailed enough, we can get a relatively high score. So yes, this is a great answer. You just fully explain the whole process of the distorted information processing and how a negative schema is formed and how the negative schema can negatively impact the individual's mental processing and further cause the depression symptoms. So yes, so I just write some bullet points for you. The second point is the key characteristics of depressive thinking. We should say the faulty patterns of thoughts lead to distorted information processing, and also we should mention about how the negative schemas would be formed and have some negative impact. Okay, so this is the second part in the first session of the answer. And the third small part is the cognitive triad, right? As you mentioned in the very beginning of the question. Cognitive triad is very important because, like before, you've already mentioned that Beck's theory, right? According to the Beck, it consists of 3 parts. Consists of 3 negative views of self, the world, and the future. Negative schemas develop during childhood as a result of early trauma and unhappy experiences, leading to a cognitive triad of beliefs in people about themselves, the world, and the future. So these 3 consist of the different parts of the cognitive triad. And the first is self. For each individual with the depression, they may see themselves as worthless and useless. And the second is the world. They may feel very overwhelmed by their environment. So they may feel very overwhelming. And also the last part is the future. The patients with the depression, they may feel their future with obstacles and see the future as hopeless. So we can describe a little bit about the cognitive triad, this theory, to explain the cognitive triad in detail and what happened in this 3 parts to the individuals. Okay, for the explanation part, we can just separate our answer into 3 small parts, which is cognitive model of depression, key characteristics of depressive thinking, and also the elaboration of the cognitive triad. This is enough. And for the second part is about the evaluation. So for the evaluation part, we should argue whether the cognitive perspective can effectively explain the cause of unipolar depression. We can simply consider it by two parts. The first part is we can generally evaluate the evidence of the cognitive explanation. And for the second part, we should search some relevant evidence to combat or support the explanation. So for the evaluation part, we mainly focus on the evidence. This is something we should remember. In the textbook, we have some relevant evidence that either support or combat the explanation, and we should remember some of them, some key points of them. So now we can recall some evidence that supports or combats the cognitive perspective to the explanation. Can you still remember some of them? Yes. Yes, great. Most of them support the cognitive perspective to explain the unipolar depression, and the most famous one is from back 1978. Exactly, as we mentioned before, right? But we've already mentioned that in the explanation part, so we better mention two more supporting evidences in the evaluation part. Yes. Yeah. D'Alessandro, 2002, as another psychologist. So what does he found? Yes, he found that students' negative views about the future are strongly associated with the increasing level of depressing mood. Yeah, so we can firstly to write the supporting evidence. Supporting evidence is the first one is about the psychologist. And what does he find? He find that students' negative views about their futures were strongly associated with an increasing depressed mood. So for this point, we can just briefly describe the procedure and the findings in this study, like those with dysfunctional beliefs about themselves who did not get into their first choice of college. They will, for this kind of students, the psychologists found that they were further doubted about the futures and developed some symptoms of depression. So according to the findings in this study, this is consistent with the application of cognitive distortion linking to a negative belief about the future. And also, the second psychologist, this study of this psychologist, the time conducted by the study is really close to the last one. Yeah, this study is from Lowenzo. This is also a psychologist team, Lowenzo ETL 2001. And for Lowenzo, she examined adolescents' depression. Do you still remember that? What did they find? Yes, great. They found that dysfunctional attitudes, rather than environmental factors, were the strongest predictors of major depressive disorder in adolescents. So this is a great finding in this field. So we can say that they find dysfunctional attitudes. So dysfunctional attitudes is really relevant to the cognitive perspective, right? Rather than environmental factors. Rather than environmental factors. So we just emphasize that it is because of dysfunctional attitudes. It's not because of environmental factors. So we say because of the dysfunctional attitudes, it is the strongest predictor. Predictors of major depressive disorder in adolescence. So the finding of this question really supports the view from the perspective explanation. While there are some other studies indicate that there's a connection between negative thinking and depression, there is limited evidence demonstrating that negative thinking existed prior to the onset of depression. So we can not fully prove the sequence of the negative thinking and the onset of the depression. So this is the limitation for this point. So we can say that in the combating evidence,